Hi everyone, and welcome to the IAB Data and Privacy Summit. So, big news over the last week or so with the Attorney General announcing that we will see draft legislation, draft privacy legislation in some form in August. This follows the Attorney General's Department's Privacy Act review report in February last year, of course, and the government's response in September. And, of course, a lot of speculation and analysis in the meantime as well. According to the recent government media release and the Attorney General's speech at the Privacy by Design Awards, the legislation will both address doxing and overhaul the Privacy Act. There's been some speculation about whether the reforms will be delivered in parts, and some reforms might come later in the year. And you never know, but all the messaging coming from the government at this stage is that we will see the drafting in August. So where are we at in the process? Back in September, as part of the government's response to the report, it indicated that it agreed with 38 of the 116 or so proposals that the department had put forward, that it rejected 10, and it agreed in principle to 68, subject to economic analysis of the impact of those proposals on industry and further consultation with industry. A number of proposals that were key to our industry were in the agreed in principle bucket, and the government indicated that there would be engagement with industry on these to ensure privacy safeguards are both feasible and balanced with risks for the industry. Fast forward to today, IAB is in the process of engaging with the government on the agreed in principle proposals, but at this stage we really still have a number of concerns. As it stands, we haven't yet seen substantial changes to indicate that the industry's concerns have been heard or that the commercial realities of our members have been understood. And so in the coming months, we will be pressing the government on the commitment that it gave to industry, as stated in its September response to the report, to engage with entities to explore whether and how what is being proposed can be implemented, and to make sure that the reforms proportionately balance privacy safeguards with the consequences for industry. And so that is the snippet from the report with that government commitment on the slide there. Which brings me to our remaining key concerns. So I should say, now that we have an indication of the time frame for the legislation, we do think that that consultation that has been committed to will now be fast-tracked. So we will be looking forward to that. So that brings me to our remaining concerns based on our recent discussions with the government. So first of all, the government strongly indicated in its February report that in order for data to fall within the scope of privacy laws, there has to be a link to a reasonably identifiable individual. The government's report rightly states where there is no link to a reasonably identifiable individual, the data isn't personal information, and that's consistent with international approaches. As some consumer advocates have themselves pointed out, data protection and privacy laws around the world turn on identifiability of an individual as a threshold, including under the GDPR. So no jurisdiction has removed the link to a reasonably identifiable individual. And from the IAB's perspective, while determining the point at which someone is identifiable in a particular context can be difficult to determine, the original intention that was expressed in the report and the link to a person's identity needs to be really clearly translated into the legislation. So that's something that we will be looking for. And that's really important so that we don't undermine the industry's important work on pets and clean rooms and all of the forward-thinking solutions that enable privacy to be balanced with industry operations. Secondly, targeting. You'll recall that we had a lot of things to say about targeting at the last Data and Privacy Summit, and from the most recent discussions that we've had with the government, they're still pursuing a broad opt-out right of receiving any content or advertising that's based on targeting, with targeting effectively being defined as inclusion or exclusion of an individual in any sort of cohort, regardless of the nature or the size of the cohort. And so the problem from our perspective is that putting data into cohorts is fundamental to how the online ecosystem works. And the way this proposal is currently being framed by government remains much broader than what's in place under the GDPR, and suggests that the commercial impact of what's being proposed still really hasn't been properly considered. So, for example, we still have the issue of, if someone opts out of receiving targeted ads, what exactly are they opting out of? So there needs to be a distinction between, in our view, broad operational cohorts on the one hand, and niche cohorts or cohorts for specific categories. If all cohorts are lumped into the same bucket, we think there'll be some nonsensical outcomes. The example we've provided previously is an organisation being required to remove individuals from broad operational cohorts like their state or local area. This doesn't make any sense, essentially, and is much more restrictive than what occurs in the offline world. So, for example, you can't, if you're driving down the freeway and you see a billboard for your local shopping centre, you can't opt out of that. Or if there's a billboard outside your office building, it's not something that you can opt out of on the grounds that you're being targeted. And as far as we know, nobody has any concerns about that. So, you know, there's a degree of tailoring of content that's completely in line with consumer expectations. So from our perspective, we need a better solution to the one that's been proposed, and one that's more consistent with consumer expectations and that reflects commercial realities. And that needs to be part of the upcoming consultative process with the government. Thirdly, targeting transparency. So this one was flagged in a general sense in the department's February report, but the government has provided a bit more detail on their thinking in subsequent discussions. And what they've indicated, essentially, as is on the slide, is that entities will be required to display information alongside targeted ads, including that the content is an ad, meaningful information about the main parameters used to determine the recipient of the ad, and information about how individuals can control ad settings. And in addition to that, large online platforms, which are not yet defined, will be expected to publish additional information. Again, here we're concerned that based on the information we have, that this just wouldn't be workable. From my discussions with people in the industry that are more technical than I am, it sounds like this would effectively require changes to key ad tech infrastructure, which isn't something that online platforms across the ecosystem will be able to implement individually or quickly. Trying to change ad tech systems across the online ecosystem would be a large piece of work from our perspective that would need to be achieved through standards-making processes internationally and would take time, assuming that there was appetite to get that done. There is some work being done by IAB Europe in this regard on standards and specs to comply with the transparency requirements there. But that work is really in the early stages and is specific to the requirements of that jurisdiction. It's not something that can be easily translated to Australia, and certainly not quickly. Separately to the ad tech infrastructure issue, there's also the issue that there are some formats, so audio, for example, that clearly haven't been contemplated in terms of how this sort of requirement would apply. So again, this is something that IAB will need to have a more detailed discussion with government about, to ensure that what is in the legislation is not something that most, if not all, companies wouldn't be able to comply with. Next is the issue of trading of personal information. And we don't take issue with requiring consent for the sale of personal information, and we didn't in our submission to the government. However, at the moment, it's very unclear what activities exactly will be considered to be trading. In particular, we are concerned that sharing of data via pets and clean rooms can continue. If that's not the case, it would have a significant negative impact on industry, and essentially impact activities like data enrichment, verification and security activities by companies across the economy. Data clean rooms, of course, have come about in response to increasingly stringent privacy laws globally to enable business activities to continue in a privacy protective way. We don't think that it's the intention of the government to undermine these technologies or activities, but it's something we need clarified in the upcoming consultations, because if we get the drafting wrong, that's the risk. Finally, just briefly on a couple of other issues, fair and reasonable and the direct right of action. So on fair and reasonable, we're still concerned that we don't have clarification around how this test will work. We need certainty that essential business operations won't be impacted. Other jurisdictions have provided industry with assurances, whether that's through a legitimate interest provision or an exemption for essential business activities or some other way. But regardless of the mechanism, it needs to be clear how essential business operations will be treated under these new provisions, and that is something we haven't seen yet. On the direct right of action, as with a number of the other proposals, the right is exceptionally broad as it currently stands. So at the moment, the combination of the lack of clarity of the substantive provisions and the exceptionally broad direct right of action and statutory tort as well creates significant risk that organisations' resources will be tied up in pointless litigation. And some organisations, to go to the risks if we don't get these things right, some organisations just will avoid undertaking activities because they won't be prepared to take on board that risk to the detriment of their operations. So the risks include over-compliance and also potentially hampering existing privacy and security processes, undermining consumer confidence online, and undermining the ability of digital businesses to survive, ultimately. Having said all that, that's been a little bit negative. So I'll try and, finish on some positives. There are some positives. First of all, business is part of the solution here to help avoid these risks. As we've said from the start, we are supportive of privacy reform and we want to work with the government to get these reforms right. Our industry is not easy to understand, and that's why we really need further engagement and consultation to make sure that these risks are avoided. Secondly, listening to the new Privacy Commissioner Carly Kine's speech during Privacy Awareness Week, I think she made some really important points, and one that resonated in particular was that, we may be behind some jurisdictions in updating our privacy laws, but there's a benefit to that. We can learn from the jurisdictions that have gone before and make sure that we don't make the same mistakes. So an example the Commissioner gave was over-compliance with GDPR when it was first introduced. And she specifically mentioned universities conducting research and the negative consequences that had within the EU. So there's a level of awareness of the unintended consequences if we don't get these things right. And that's exactly the sort of thing that we want to avoid here. And while people tend not to think of advertising in the same light as research, advertising funds critical content and services, and the potential to essentially damage, or the potential damage to consumers from over-compliance would actually be quite significant. So we do need to get things right. Finally, just before handing over to you, JJ, IAB will be focused, in terms of next steps, IAB will be focused in the next little while on working with the government, and we hope that consultations at this point will ramp up. But I should also mention, to allay concerns of some people in the room, that once the bill passes the Parliament, in terms of timing, the government has indicated that we will have a 2-year transition period for most of the provisions in the Act. They did talk about potentially not having the trading provisions come into effect more quickly, but there will be time to essentially ensure that organisations will comply. So, secondly, we will be looking at the work that's been done in by our international IAB counterparts in other jurisdictions, as well over the next little while, including on projects like the GPP to assist industry to comply with the law. So we hope that that will be a valuable piece of work as well. On that note, over to you, JJ.